Welcome, everyone. My name is Sue Harmon, and I'm a librarian at the Manchester City Library in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today for the part 4 of our Culturally Curious Art Series, Keith Haring, AIDS, Advocacy and Art. I'm joined today by Jane Martina from the Wadley Memorial Library and Liz Erickson from the Goffstown Public Library. In conjunction with New England College Libraries, this program was made possible by all of our libraries combined, and we're very excited to be able to offer educational programs to our patrons. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees are automatically muted to cut down on background noise. Jane will answer questions at the end of the program, so please use the chat box for questions. Make sure that the message is going to everyone. Any messages that are sent to me personally won't be read aloud. And this program is also being recorded. Your feedback is important to us. I'll be putting a link to a survey in the chat window at the end of the program. Please follow that link to fill out a brief survey. Your responses will really help us plan our future programs. You can let us know what types of programs you'd like to see in the future and give us your email to sign up for newsletter for all of the upcoming programs and library news. Speaking of upcoming programs, I want to tell you about a program this coming up later this month. On June 23rd, please join us for Abby Hutchinson's Sweet Songs of Freedom. Deborah Goss performs as New Hampshire-born abolitionist, suffragist, and singer Abby Hutchinson, who became famous for singing anti-slavery songs with her brothers as the Hutchinson family singers during the 1840s.
And also on June 23rd at the Wadley Memorial Library, we'll be hosting Claire Evans virtually and her program From Uptown Girls to Downton Abbey, How American Gilded Age Heiresses Invaded the British Aristocracy. Registration is required for this event, so you can sign up by going to our website, wadleylibrary.org, clicking on events to view the calendar listings.
And well, unfortunately, not until July 26th. But the Goffstown Public Library will be hosting a scientist from the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy to talk about the research they're doing on the white shark population off the coast of Cape Cod, how that research moves conservation efforts forward, and the important role that sharks play in the ecosystem. This is all in celebration of everyone's favorite summer holiday, Shark Week. This program will be held in person in the library, but you'll be able to join us virtually if you prefer. That's coming up on July 26th at 7 p.m. Registration is required, and you can register online at the web address at the bottom, and then taking a look at our calendar. This program is generously funded by the Friends of the Goffstown Public Library, so we hope to see you there.
Thank you. All right, the presenter today is Jane O'Neill. She curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England and beyond. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. A New Hampshire native, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. For more information, visit iamculturallycurious.com. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Jane. Thank you so much for coming and giving us another presentation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much to all of the hosting libraries tonight and to everybody who is joining us. We are in for such a treat because Keith Haring's imagery, I think, really just delights so many people. So just to give you kind of a brief introduction before we launch in, basically between 1980 and 1990, Keith Haring established himself as an art world celebrity and a pop culture icon with this really distinctive visual style that we see here. It's sort of instantly recognizable, and it kind of came to define the entire decade. He said, art is for everyone, and he matched his critical and commercial success with a mission to make his work as accessible to people as possible. So I can see from our guest list tonight that we have a celebrated muralist from the Manchester area who I think will really, I think Keith Haring's work will especially resonate with you tonight. So I'm glad you could join us. Now, Keith Haring also was impacted by the AIDS epidemic, and we will see tonight too how how he advocated in that particular area, as well as a few others. So there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that we end as close to 8 as possible. So I'm just going to dive right in. We've got our program overview. I've broken this up into a couple of different sections. We'll get an introduction to the artist. We'll get started looking essentially at graffiti art, and then how he sort of launches into the world of fame and acclaim, and then ties his work into commercial success. A lot of people in the art world sort of eschew that that element of success. They're looking more for people who can spend a lot of money on a single work, but Keith Haring thought, why not find people who can spend a little bit of money on a lot of work? And then his public projects, his murals are really inspiring. And then we'll finish up with his advocacy around AIDS and his legacy. And this is, of course, a photograph of the artist himself. So let's get started getting to know young Keith Haring. He was born in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. Well, he grew up in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, and he was born in 1958. He was a part of, the all-American family. He was the oldest of 4 and the only boy in the family. He had a special relationship with his father, who was himself an amateur cartoonist, and they would sort of draw together as early as around the time that Keith was just 1 year old. And so that was a relationship that extended for years, where it was, father and son spending this time being creative in terms of doodling and cartooning. Now, as he was growing up, he was really focused on drawing. It was a primary passion for him, but that's not to say that he was unaware of what was happening in the world around him. He was really too young to participate in the cultural and political revolutions that were happening in the 1960s, but he did have a sense of what was going on. And I would say that it contributed to a heightened sense, a heightened consciousness and awareness of social, political, economic factors in the 1980s. I love this picture of him sitting on his bed. One of his younger sisters reports that he spent so much time in his room listening to music, drawing all the time, and we can see a little Snoopy dog behind him. Charles Schulz was certainly one of his inspirations, as was Walt Disney and Dr. Seuss. So these cartoonists who are so familiar to so many of us served as early inspiration for this young artist too. And this is just a really sweet detail here. He actually wrote at the age of 10, when I grow up, I would like to be an artist in France. The reason is because I like to draw. I would get my money from pictures that I would sell. I hope I will be one. And we will see, this works out pretty much according to his 10-year-old plan. Keith Haring graduates from high school in 1976. We can see he's grown his hair out long. He's definitely impacted by kind of the hippie movement. And shortly after his graduation, he moves to the big city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to study how to do commercial art. He went to a school called the Ivy School of Professional Art, and he very quickly became disenchanted with it. He found that everybody who was working or studying commercial art sort of had their side passion project. And for him, he thought, why not make the passion project your life? Why not dedicate your life to that? Now, he did have his first one-man exhibition while he was in Pittsburgh, and he also had exposure to other artists, a little bit of an art historical primer, really. And there were 2 artists in particular whose work really resonated with him. And so one of those artists was Jackson Pollock. We can see one of his early 1950s splatter paintings over here on the left. This one's called Convergence. And Jackson Pollock, of course, was the artist that kind of threw paint down on the ground with the canvas spread out on the floor. And it was a really intuitive process. He wouldn't plan this, but we can see the emphasis on line and in all over design and abstraction, and this sense of the unconscious sort of taking over the process. We'll see that sort of links into what we'll see with Keith Haring's work too. Keith Haring was also really influenced by the artist Christo, who's now known as Christo and Jean-Claude. And so he saw their temporary installations, in this case, the running fence, a temporary 2-week long installation of a 24.5-mile fence, 18 feet high, that ran all along the California coast in Northern California. Now, a project like that sort of blew Keith Haring's mind. The sense sense that you don't need to constrain your work to a gallery or to a museum. It could be so much bigger. It could be temporary, and it could involve as many people as you wanted. So that really kind of transformed the way he even thought about art. So he's disenchanted with commercial art. And when he's just 20 years old, he decides to leave Pennsylvania and head to New York City. Here he is, of course, in a New York City subway, looking a little bored, but he was enrolled in the School of Visual Arts. And while he was there, he's studying painting, sculpture, art history, performance art, and a little bit of semiotics too. So he's studying the history and the language of signs and signifiers and how they would be interpreted. So this is all going to have a huge impact on his work as the ball gets rolling. Now he's in New York City. It's 1980. And there's a lot of really kind of interesting things happening, especially in the East Village where he was located. There was a little bit of a cultural revolution happening. Young people, creatives, all coming together, forming this kind of a subculture or counterculture. And he was very much involved with it. So we see a lot of graffiti on this train, and the graffiti is certainly something that inspired Keith Haring. So let's talk a little bit about street art and subway drawing, because this is in essence how he finds himself as an artist. Now, these two images here of graffiti trains are not examples of Keith Haring's work, but this was the kind of work that he was seeing all around New York City while he's there. It was ubiquitous, and it was a little bit just before the big anti-graffiti movement in New York City. So these subway cars were coded. And for Keith Haring, he wrote, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, this graffiti. These artists are working rapidly. They're using text, they're using visuals. Everything has this strong black outline. And there's this total confidence to the way they would execute something. They're not going back and editing their work after the fact. It's like they're tagging something and moving on. And this was a huge inspiration to him. As he was studying at the School of Visual Arts, he became connected to a graffiti artist, an artist who would become world famous in his own right, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who we can see alongside Keith Haring in the photograph on the left, and then standing in front of some of his own graffiti on the right. So he's sort of in these circles. He knows graffiti artists. But Keith Haring also had the sensibility in the early 1980s that this was an art form that was primarily within the realm of the African-American community, of the Latino community, and he didn't want to usurp it, really. And he didn't want to take away from what was happening. He wanted to find his own voice, but in a similar vein. That's not to say that he didn't spray paint a few things here or there, but he experimented with how he was going to make his mark. At first, he was experimenting with text. He would take issues of the Saturday Evening Post and cut them up and reorganize the headlines into things that sort of pointed out power and violence, but of course were silly in some way too. I mean, Reagan slain by hero cop is not something that you'd ever see on the New York Post. And he would Xerox these and then make hundreds of copies, put them up on signposts all over the city. He loved this idea of kind of invading people's consciousness, but in the end, that wasn't really what made his spirit sing as an artist. He found that one day when he was riding in the subway, and as he got off the train, on the platform of the subway, there was this black matte paper that was just covering up an expired ad in the New York City subway system. And it was just blank. And he thought to himself, that is where I'm going to draw. He ran up the stairs to the street level. He bought some chalk and then ran back down into the subway and immediately began drawing. And he was working as quickly as those graffiti artists with spray paint, but he was, of course, using chalk. So in some ways, I think he almost gets a pass in some ways, because it doesn't feel like graffiti because it's temporary paper, it's a temporary marking, but this was kind of dangerous work because this was still considered graffiti in the day. So he had to work very quickly. And I think one of the really distinctive elements about his work is that all throughout his career, everything is executed very quickly with a very confident line. If somebody just gave you a pencil right now, you'd probably make a lot of sketchy movements. He could just sort of kind of sketch out something immediately without any preparation, without any forethought to what the design would be. And of course, he's using these little outline figures, almost like the chalk outline of a figure of somebody at a crime scene. But instead, these figures sort of read as archetypes. They're everyman, and they become instantly recognizable. The pictures themselves seem fairly easy to read. So here are a few more images of Keith Haring working rapidly, trying to evade detection in the subway system. He began making these drawings, 30 or 40 of them a day, moving on the trains all over the city. And I know people who were living in New York City at this time, and they talked about what a delight it was to, get out of your morning routine, the drudgery of commuting to your job, and to see one of these designs sort of spring up, to pop up, to anticipate seeing the next one. So you can see that when people stumble across him working, they kind of stick around and they watch him. And he loved this element. This was that idea of reaching the masses. This was connecting with everyday people. The people in the subway who were watching him might not have been the type of people to go to an art museum or to a gallery opening. And he just thought it was fantastic that he could connect with them in some ways. So once again, he's using this visual language that was so easy to recognize and understand. You can almost think of it as like a hieroglyph with a really broad appeal. So let's take another look at some of his drawings here. It's that standard outline character. They always seem to be moving, whether they're dancing or running. He always adds the little motion lines. Oftentimes his images have incredibly positive messages to them. Two figures coming together and touching this kind of radiating heart. Here we see a radiating baby in a head that is the shape of a heart. So there's a sweetness to a lot of these. There's also, in some cases, a little bit of a sense of doom. He oftentimes references nuclear power plants and uses nuclear symbols. He grew up in the era of 3 Mile Island, so he had this anxiety about nuclear holocaust. So that entered into some of his artwork. Sometimes he would make barking dogs that seemed fearsome. Sometimes they seem tamed. We can see that he's using the same spaceship in these two images, but he's using them in very different ways. So this is semiotics coming into play. He's essentially establishing a visual vocabulary, and the meaning changes depending on the different icons that he integrates into a given work of art. Here's another image of him working quickly. So ultimately, you can think of Haring's subway drawings as a synthesis of performance art, because he's doing this for people who are on the go, as automatic writing, sort of like Jackson Pollock. He's just doing it quickly without any sort of preparation. And it's about democratic access. It's about giving this image to as many people as possible. So occasionally he would have run-ins with the law. Like I said, it was illegal to do what he was doing, even though it wasn't anything permanent. So he was arrested many times for criminal mischief and for defacing public property. This is a screen grab actually from CBS News. They were doing a little segment on him and he was doing his drawings in the subway. I highly recommend looking up a few videos on YouTube, because you can find him doing this, and he did it so fast. And CBS caught him on camera getting arrested. You can see that he's wearing a t-shirt with the little radiating baby here. He adopted that as his signature, as his logo, because to him, that time in our lives being a baby was like the purest form of the human experience. He says there's nothing negative associated with a baby ever. So we'll kind of wrap up on these subway drawings with this last incredible image. He had a friend named Seng Kwon Chi, who was a photographer. And after a day of tagging all throughout the city, he would call his photographer friend and alert him to the different locations so that he could record them on camera. And this is just such a great image here because you can see what Keith Haring had just accomplished on this, blank space inside the subway system. One of those recognizable figures who's in this case sort of riding a centipede that happens to have a computer for a head. You can almost think of these black panels as functioning like blank computer screens or blank televisions in some ways. But I love this because it's as though Keith Haring has just slipped into the subway, just evading detection. I'm sure there's some sense of relief and accomplishment that goes along with that. And the subway door is just closing and perfectly framing that drawing. And we can see, all of the graffiti on the subway and how different Keith Haring's visual vocabulary is right off the bat. These days, those drawings are in museum collections. So if you go on eBay and you see them listed for $200, I have a feeling those are not authentic Keith Haring subway drawings. They're rare and they are highly valued. And people began to steal them and sell them even back in the early 1980s. So those subway drawings helped to launch Keith Haring into fame and acclaim. So by the early 1980s, he was getting gallery exhibitions in New York City. Look at how packed this gallery is. That's like, chock-a-block full with all of his artwork. Over here on the right, we can see that he has been invited to a museum to paint a mural, which he is doing all freehand, no preparation. He's just banging this out so quickly. So he's being invited around the world really to execute works at museums and in public spaces. So even the art world is taking notice. He's becoming an international success just a few years into his time in New York City. It was really a meteoric rise. And this work that we see in the background here he is in front of it. And I think it was that same CBS news broadcast that I referred to before, they show him painting this work and they said it took him 2 hours to do it. And then he sold it for $15,000. And that's 1980s money too. So, I mean, he was incredibly successful at a very young age. So he's penetrated this elitist kind of skeptical world of fine art, but he remains true to some of his original passions, which are kind of tied more towards the underground culture in New York City. So even though he's successful and famous, he could move from the world of high art to dance clubs, underground clubs, and he could do this sort of seamlessly. We are looking at Keith Haring having a cathartic experience on the dance floor in a club called the Paradise Garage. This was like his favorite place to go to. Look, he's even painted the walls here. It was a place that was very open and accepting. It was gay, straight, it was multicultural, so you could connect with anybody there. And he talked about his experience dancing on the floor at the Paradise Garage as being a quasi-religious experience for him. And it's probably not surprising then that some of Keith Haring's most recognizable images are these dancing figures. It's that same archetypal character. It's the outline figure. We can see them in all these kind of wild poses that you can imagine this very man over here making. And I want to point out too, this is important, that all of these figures have different skin colors. Of course, these skin colors don't correspond to skin colors in the real world, but it's important because he was attracted to spaces that were open and welcoming, particularly as a young gay man in New York City. So having a space where that is multicultural, that is open and accepting, and reflecting that in his artwork was immensely important. room. Now, one of the other clubs that he went to early on was called Club 57. He would go dancing there. He also did open mic poetry nights, and he would perform with this television frame around his head, as you can see in the photograph over here. And we'll get back to Club 57 in just a moment, but you will see a few references to TV screen heads in his artwork throughout the night. Later on in his career, he's asked to paint a huge mural at another nightclub and many other nightclubs in between. This is the Palladium over here on the right. So at Club 57 in the early 1980s, there's a lot of really creative people who are gathering together at this little hotspot. We've got in this very picture here, Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat, we've got Madonna, we've got Keith Haring, and you can see them all sort of gathering around Keith Haring in this particular image. But this was a place frequented by Cyndi Lauper, the B-52s, RuPaul, Fab Five Freddy. Everybody seemingly was there. It was a real melting pot. And as Keith Haring's very good friend, Kenny Scharf, who was also a fellow artist, as he recalled, at Club 57, there were drugs, there were promiscuity. It was what he said, it was one big orgy family. Sometimes I'd look around and say, oh my God, I've had sex with everybody in this room. It was just the spirit of the times, and it was before AIDS. Everybody there was either living together or sleeping together. So there was a true intimacy in this aspect of his life. Keith Haring incidentally stayed very close to Madonna in particular, and their careers both kind of took off simultaneously. She's written and spoken a lot about this relationship. She referred to Keith Haring as being like, she and Keith Haring were sort of like two sides of the same coin. So here she is wearing a leather jacket that he painted. These are two tabloids that he modified with his artwork that he gave to her as a gift for her wedding in 1985 to Sean Penn. Keith Haring was able to make a lot of really influential friends at a young age in those early years of the 1980s. So along with Jean-Michel Basquiat, he began hanging around with none other than Andy Warhol. This is them hanging out at Andy Warhol's studio called The Factory. Here he is with those same tabloids, getting ready to go to Madonna's wedding with Andy Warhol. He had tremendous respect for Andy Warhol and his trailblazing career in the arts. Andy Warhol, of course, was the forerunner in pop art in America. He was the artist who painted Campbell's soup cans and convinced the American public that that was as much art as a traditional landscape or portrait. So in order to honor Andy Warhol, Keith Haring turned him into another icon. Thinking back to his love for Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse, he would paint these little cartoons of Andy Warhol as Mickey Mouse. You add some ears to somebody and they become an American icon. Keith Haring went a step forward and added a lot of dollar signs to these images of Andy Mouse. And to him, he said, just putting the dollar sign on him made him even more an icon and more of a representation of the American dream. So these two artists were in this kind of perpetual cycle of reinforcing each other's celebrity and status. This is this kind of dreamy portrait that Andy Warhol executed of Keith Haring. Keith Haring added his little signature and his depiction of Andy Warhol. So you can imagine this became a collector's item really quickly. The friendship with Andy Warhol led Keith Haring to other relationships, and that included a longstanding relationship with Grace Jones, who you can see here. She was the musician and model. Keith Haring painted her body for an interview and a feature in Andy Warhol's magazine called Interview Magazine. And from then on, he and Grace Jones would go clubbing together, they'd collaborate. He was also really interested in the world of hip hop. He loved to watch break dancers and how they moved. You almost get a sense of that with some of the images of the figures moving in the background here. So here he is with Run DMC, probably the most influential influential hip hop group of the 1980s. I think this is for an Adidas promotion, but Keith Haring also designed album covers for them. So he's deeply integrated into the world of music. He's connecting with all of these other icons too. When you're friends with Yoko Ono, I just feel like you've arrived. Here he is with Yoko Ono and one of her sons. Here's Yoko Ono with Keith Haring and his parents. So you can only imagine what his parents thought about their son and his success in the 1980s. Keith Haring did, in fact, also collaborate with Yoko Ono on, at least on in this one way, for a week-long event called Dance Plus. Yoko Ono, and this is just like a little promotion material for it, but Yoko Ono did the music for it. Keith Haring designed the sets, and they were close enough that you have this incredible series of images where Keith Haring is hanging out at Yoko Ono's house on the occasion of her son Sean's 9th birthday, where he had just, and this is Sean Lennon right here, he's just received his first Macintosh computer, and who else but Steve Jobs is there to show him how to use it. And this is, of course, Andy Warhol sitting in the background looking a little bit bored, probably a little mad that the focus isn't on him. But notice what's on the computer screen here, one of Keith Haring's designs. So what a moment in history. We'll wrap up this section on fame and acclaim and all of these important relationships with this image of Keith Haring sitting in his own apartment in New York City. You can see he invited graffiti artists to work their magic in his personal space in his home. He's got a few of his iconic inspirations around other cartoons. We've got Gumby in the foreground, but notice here the refrigerator door. He almost used it as like a guest register. He invited all of his friends to come in and sign it, tag it, what have you. And so over the years, I think about 90 different artists put their name on it. And somewhere, I have yet to see it in these image here, but somewhere Madonna even wrote "Madonna loves Keith" on this refrigerator door. When he left this apartment, he left the fridge and the landlord painted over the apartment. But the next tenant recognized how significant this refrigerator door was. And the day that the fridge died, the landlord put it out on the sidewalk. And so the next tenant went, took the door, basically stored it in her parents' attic for about the next 20, 30 years. And then it was recently auctioned off for, I believe, $25,000. So think of how expensive your own appliances are. Add a few Andy Warhol signatures and it goes way up in value. So we'll turn our attention now to one facet of Keith Haring's artwork that is actually highly criticized, and kind of explore how he got there. So he moved in some ways sort of seamlessly between the world of high art, fine art, and the world of commercial art. And we'll talk a little bit about how and why he got there. Now, he was working in a very simple form, and it was one that was pretty easy to kind of rip off. And before too long, in the 1980s, he was getting plagiarized works, examples of plagiarized works, works done in his style from all over the world. There was clearly a demand for what he was producing. It was speaking to people. And that's when he decided to open his own shop, which he called the Pop Shop. And this was something that was encouraged by Andy Warhol. This was opened in 1986. He said, "The Pop Shop makes my work accessible. It's about participation on a big level." Of course, critics, art historians, they despaired over this. They thought it cheapened his work. They compared it to, making art that's like fast food. Inside, Keith Haring decorated the entire space. You can see floor to ceiling, and you could buy anything there that had Keith Haring's designs on it. But everything was priced pretty reasonably. You could get his button with the radiating baby there for just about $3. So he wasn't trying to rake anybody over the coals in terms of the financials. It was really just about making his artwork accessible. So in this image here, where we can see him hanging out in the pop shop, you can see a couple of examples of t-shirts that were being sold there, but there's also one right back here that features Andy Warhol. And I can't state enough how influential Andy Warhol was in an endeavor like this. Andy Warhol was an artist who fantasized about being a machine himself, fantasized about a mechanized future. He was creating prints, especially in his heyday, that could be easily replicated. And he thought that that was the future. And certainly creating a space like the pop shop would have been a great extension for Andy Warhol's philosophy. So you have a couple of examples here of Keith Haring prints that are simply called pop shop. And you can see that he shows one of his figures, his outline figures, sort of struggling with machinery, struggling with the mechanized world. And in this case, maybe this is a figure that's like inside the machine trying to fix it. But I also kind of read it as one of these figures is sort of cranking out one of these cartoons, just pulling it right out of the machine here. So it's that dangerous flirtation, at least in the art world, with commercial success, mass production of things. Incidentally, the pop shop ran for nearly 20 years. It closed down in 2005. When it did, that ceiling mural was transferred to the New York Historical Society. So when you go and visit there, it's hanging over the admissions desk. And these days, you can still buy licensed Keith Haring merchandise online, and the prices are still really reasonable. Like, this is better than most museum shops over here. So during his lifetime, Keith Haring licensed his designs for a variety of products. What is more 80s than a Swatch watch? He did 4 designs for them, most of them featuring his dancing figures. And occasionally he would sign the straps of those Swatch watches. They've become huge collectible items now. So this particular set with a signed wristband was being sold online for $10,000. And just a reminder, Swatch watches were sold for about $50 back in the 1980s. He also lent his designs to the Absolute Vodka marketing campaign, like the longest, most successful marketing campaign of all time. Andy Warhol had already done an ad for them and encouraged Keith Haring to do it. So what we see over here is the iconic, recognizable figures who look like they're having a great time dancing the night away at the Paradise Garage, a la Keith Haring and his Saturday nights. And you have the Absolute Vodka bottle sort of superimposed over that. Notice that it's asymmetrical. And that's really, I mean, that's like the crux of the campaign, right? The recognizable bottle here. But because Keith Haring does everything freehand, without plan or preparation, you get that little bit of asymmetry in a lot of his works. He also lent his talents to various marketing campaigns for various car companies, everything from Buick to BMW. Here he is painting a child-sized Ferrari, but he's just covering these things with this kind of visual vocabulary that he's developed, this very recognizable visual vocabulary. So it reminds me once again of that Jackson Pollock painting that we started with, something that is densely patterned, and it's really the artist almost, going into tapping into the unconscious, just working and applying marks to the surface in this case, and creating this really dense visual pattern. Now, after his death, the Keith Haring Foundation became responsible for licensing Keith Haring's imagery. And so it was licensed for anything from espresso cups to dog bowls to Abercrombie and Fitch t-shirts to MAC cosmetics. If you really like Keith Haring, you can get a Keith Haring rug at Ruggable these days. You can get a chess set inspired by his designs at MoMA. And going full circle, there's even Funko Pop figurines that are just Keith Haring now. So he himself has become commodified. So if this is leaving a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth, I think we're going to redeem Keith Haring in this next section when we talk about his public works. He painted about 50 public works, public murals over the course of his decade-long career. And in places like Melbourne, Australia, Paris, Pisa, Barcelona, the Berlin Wall. So we're going to get a little bit of a sense of those. We're starting off in the middle of his career. This is a 1986 mural that he did. It's probably one of his famous, the Crack is Whack mural. Now, he'd been painting murals for quite some time at this point, and he was sort of taken with this blank wall that was easily visible by alongside this bridge that connected Harlem to the Bronx. And every time he drove by it, he thought, it looks like it should be a billboard. And at the time, it was an empty, abandoned handball court. So he was personally impacted by the crack epidemic in New York City in the 1980s. He was aware of it, but impacted because one of his studio assistants became addicted to crack and was really struggling because there were so few options for recovery at the time. So one day, Keith Haring just rented a truck. He put some ladders and some paint in, and he just walked up to this abandoned wall and started painting. He did not ask anyone for permission to do this. And this is him standing in front of the Crack is Whack mural right after he was done. These are, and he always worked so quickly that he could finish a project like this within a few hours, if not within the space of a single day. I love this image over here because we can see as he's working, there's just a couple of kids on bikes who are just sitting there watching him paint. And of course, this is what he lives for. It's all sort of performative too. So the Crack is Whack mural shows us, a crack pipe, burning money, skulls, a human figure with a death sentence. That's usually the X on the chest that's being fed to this monster. It's easily understandable imagery here. And we can see Keith Haring up on a ladder finishing the work. He did say at one point, if you have a ladder, you look official. Nobody asks you what you're up to. But he made the mistake once he was done of sitting down and smoking a joint. And that's when the police showed up and asked him what he was doing there. And that's when he got arrested for doing this mural. It was considered graffiti. So he faced a year in jail for doing this. And during the sort of sentencing delay, this image became something that was used in news reporting about the crack epidemic. It became like a powerful visual. I think even the city of New York was using it in public messaging around the crack epidemic. So the mayor of New York City faced this kind of crisis. He's like, I'm anti-crack, I'm anti-graffiti. How do I handle this? So they reduced his sentence down to just $100, which at the time he could very easily pay. But then they ran into a problem because this was becoming recognized and celebrated. But then somebody came and graffitied his graffiti mural. So he was invited back to the same abandoned handball court to paint a new Crack is Whack mural, which we can see over here. I think that the second one is better. Here he is in front of the blank wall. This is actually the head of the Parks Department in New York City, who's now there and very grateful that Keith Haring is painting and he's helping him out. Here's the end result, the new Crack is Whack mural, which is still there today. I think this is a more powerful statement, more in line with his body of work too. A skeleton holding a crack pipe, burning money, but he's like kind of this oversized figure that's resting on all of these writhing forms here. Usually Keith Haring is painting dancers, but these look like figures that are in like a medieval painting of hell. So I think there's in many ways a more successful work that is here. He painted the other side as well. These murals have been recently restored. Like I said, they are still a part of the city there. And they're in fact such icons. They're such signifiers in the city that the entire park around them is called Crack is Whack Playground. Can you imagine taking your kids or meeting your friends? I'll meet you at Crack is Whack. See you there in a half an hour. So like I said, he was painting these murals around the world. This is a mural he was doing in Melbourne, Australia. Now, this is so impressive to me because he's up on the scaffolding, he's up in this cherry picker, and he's just banging out these figures so quickly. He's so familiar with the quality of line that it takes to make an arm, make a leg, make a head. And so he could execute a whole wall in just the space of a few hours. And remarkably, he never stopped to step back from the work and get a sense of scale and proportion. Even Michelangelo had to do that with the Sistine Chapel. Keith Haring just kept working. And so he's using all of his familiar figures here, his dancing figures. In this case, they look almost like they're falling underneath the centipede type figure with figures riding it. And the centipede has this sort of sphinx-like pose with a head that is a computer and the brain is inside the computer. So there's a lot of imagery here that I think just ties in so beautifully to the 1980s. Here is another mural that he executed within the space of one day. This is painted on vellum, which was used as like a light filter in this museum in Amsterdam. And this is a work that he spray painted. Like I said, he did the entire work in one day in front of people in the museum. And I love, seeing him here in the photographs with the socks on, but just imagining how quickly he had to execute something like this, and holding a can of spray paint for that long, I mean, can really hurt your hands. So it's really amazing to me how he can do something like this on such a grand scale. This particular mural is, I think, about 40 by almost 70 feet. So a huge undertaking. In 1986, consequentially, Keith Haring was invited to Berlin to paint a mural on the Berlin Wall. It was the Checkpoint Charlie Museum that actually invited him. So here he is 6 feet into the territory of East Berlin with this section of the Berlin Wall, which stood 14 feet at the time. And there were guards in towers right nearby. They had, machine guns strapped to their chests. This was the most famous section of the Iron Curtain. And so just going there to do a mural was something he could have easily been arrested for, something he could have easily been shot for doing. This was a life or death kind of commission. But he really believed in kind of tearing down the wall. I mean, he was against what this wall stood for. So he was happy to do the commission. The wall itself was painted yellow in advance of his arrival. And then he used black and red paint. So all of these three colors together were a reference to the traditional German flag. The end result is he painted about 300 feet of wall in 5 hours. And while he was there doing it, there was a media circus around him. People were taking pictures. There was a helicopter, an American helicopter buzzing overhead, watching him through the whole time. He said he'd never painted in such a circus-like atmosphere, but he was really committed to the purpose of him being there. He said it was a humanistic gesture, even though it was a provocative one. It was more than just a temporary installation. The mural, he said, was a political and subversive act meant to psychologically destroy the wall by painting it. So here he is with the finished work in a few posed photographs. The New York Times wrote, "The entire world should know that it happened, reinforcing its political significance." Now, unfortunately, just I think within a day after this mural was done, people began to graffiti it. In fact, one person went and painted all of this gray over it, defacing it, and said, something as essentially something as grim and as horrible as this wall should not have these cartoons on it. So, so within, the space of days, it was nearly impossible to see it. So it was just 3 years later that the Berlin Wall was torn down. The Iron Curtain comes down, at least in Berlin, which was, such a consequential event. And at that point, Keith Haring's work is all but disappeared. And it was only 100 days after this incredible event that Keith Haring passed away. So it's incredible now to think that the wall is no more, the mural is no more, and even Keith Haring is no more. But he even wrote in his journal about how the camera makes everything permanent. Recognizing that it's still so important to do these temporary works. One of his last major public works is this one here in Pisa. You can see he has gotten almost surreal with his imagery at this point. This is 1989. He's painting on the side of a church. He's invited to do this in Pisa. He's using some of his familiar visual vocabulary, sort of a devil and a saint, a mother and child, those glowing rods that he oftentimes uses. But here he's like mixing forms, human and bird. He's elongating parts of bodies. He's exaggerating, distorting them. And it is all sort of a wild take on what he's probably best known for. You almost get the sense that in his final days, he was feeling maybe a little bit more free in some ways, although the marketing materials that he created are like, classic Keith Haring. So as we wrap up on his public works, I just wanted to emphasize how committed he was to working with children. It was a huge priority. It was part of his mission, really. So this is one of the biggest works that he executed. It's a massive mural painted freehand of the Statue of Liberty. This fabric that he painted on is 90 feet tall, and he did this to acknowledge the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. And then in terms of working with children, he invited 900 children from every borough of New York City to come and fill in the drawing that he created, which is ultimately 6 feet high. Now, this work was used as a backdrop for Paul McCartney playing at the Super Bowl just as recently back as 2002. So right on the heels of September 11th, this image was still considered one that was a powerful image of unity and patriotism. He painted this exterior stairwell next to a children's hospital in Paris. We can see the Eiffel Tower in the background here. So you've got these bright primary colors, his recognizable figures as well. The hospital is no more, but they maintain the tower that the staircase, which is now just this Keith Haring tower. But it's these, it has this wonderful playful quality, and he prioritized making work outside of children's hospitals. He worked with sculpture fabricators to create this piece outside of a children's hospital in Long Island. And he even talked about how his sculpture was designed to be played with. He sort of fancied himself to be potentially a great playground designer. I've always loved this figure that he did doing backbends. He talked about people having lunch underneath, in the shade of these figures and climbing all over them. If he had lived longer, maybe he could have had a whole other branch of what he was doing to create playgrounds for people in need. But we'll wrap up his public works with this unusual one. And look at the body language here. Look at the facial expression. There is something different that's happening with this work. This is a mural that he painted at the White House in 1988 as part of their Easter Sunday celebration. So we see not his familiar characters, but cartoon characters appropriate for a kids event. This mural was actually donated to a children's hospital nearby. But this is happening in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, when most people who were affected by it or interested in it really felt like the Reagan White House was turning a blind eye and not acting on the epidemic at all. So here he is literally on the grounds of the White House making this kind of artwork. And incidentally, one of the cameramen there actually said to him, like, what are you doing here? Like, you're a gay man, and you know so many people who've been impacted by this disease. How could you be here? And I think the body language really says how conflicted he was about this particular commission. So we'll wrap up tonight with his work in and around AIDS and advocacy. Because of the fact that he grew up in the 1960s, he had this heightened awareness about what was happening in the world. As a successful artist, he donated his designs to all types of charities. In this case, Rain Dance, a benefit for the African Emergency Relief Fund. Crackdown was a benefit concert. He did all kinds of posters for anti-apartheid groups as well. But as a gay man, and later as a gay man living with AIDS, he was someone who became particularly committed to the cause of educating and preventing AIDS. This is a really incredible photograph of him by the photographer Annie Leibovitz from 1986. And incidentally, I mean, we think of the power of Keith Haring's lines, but for him, this was connected to his sexuality. He actually wrote in his journal, "Sexual energy may be the single strongest impulse I feel, more than art." And he told his biographer that his drawings were connected to his sense of sexuality. So all of this is sort of one and the same for him. We can see him taking up the subject very gently of being gay or being homosexual in those early subway drawings, having two figures that could be read as male figures coming together around a heart or being combined with a heart. But by the time he is out of the closet, by the time he is HIV positive and really serving as a spokesperson for the gay community, his artwork reflects that too. He's doing posters for National Coming Out Day, posters for the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York City. And he recognizes that that essentially behaviors around sex, gay sex, really need to change. So that was a life and death mission, really. And so he created works that were really taboo busting for the day. He was focusing on aspects of gay life and aspects of sexuality that artists before him didn't ever have to grapple with because AIDS was not a factor. But here he was living in a time where his friends, his essentially his entire community is being wiped out in New York City, being decimated. So he showed up. I mean, he was a person going to rallies, but really the most important thing he could do was to lend his artwork to this cause. And he did so again and again and again. So he donated his artwork to help the organization ACT UP. And he would use this symbolism again and again of like the three wise monkeys, the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, this notion of turning a blind eye to the pandemic. And consequently, in this case, we are seeing this is like modified dancing figures here. So he is saying that gay people, the people that he was out dancing with at clubs on Saturday nights, who have AIDS, who have this death sentence, the X's on their chest, they cannot afford to turn a blind eye. Silence equals death. Ignorance equals fear. This was really powerful visual language here. Stopping AIDS is, cutting this serpent in half. And it really requires these two figures working together in unison, in conjunction, in order to do that. It's having those conversations. Now, Keith Haring did not invent the pink triangle as like the symbol for ACT UP, but he appropriated it in some of his artwork. We can see over here, he's densely patterned the pink triangle with the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil figures. He also used those same figures in artwork that was included in a guide for teens, so educational materials. And then in a poster for ACT UP, he's using those familiar dancing figures who are now acting up. They're throwing their hands up in the air. They have the X's on their chest. They have been marked. They have a death sentence, and they're not dancing now. They are literally activating their bodies in an entirely new way for a new cause. He also contributed his artwork to the album cover for Red Hot and Dance, and that was from the Red Hot organization, a nonprofit that was fighting AIDS through pop culture, essentially. So he had a really important role in helping to fight AIDS, educate people around AIDS. These images were really powerful, and I can't underscore enough how they really stood out in terms of the art world and also the world of pop culture. I mean, they were frank depictions of sexuality and gay sexuality at a time when it was still very much sort of a hush hush issue in American life. Keith Haring also founded the Keith Haring Foundation in 1989, and that foundation helped to ensure that his philanthropic mission would continue on in perpetuity. The foundation's mission is to serve organizations that serve children, but also, and probably most importantly, to help organizations that educate around AIDS and help to prevent and care for people with AIDS. So here they've got the symbol of the radiating baby, and here's just one of their mobile units, which is also, decorated with his designs. Now, all of this comes to an abrupt end because Keith Haring dies in 1990 due to AIDS-related complications. So, of course, his artistic output immediately ends. And what we're looking at now is a quilt paying homage to his life, his career, celebrating who he was by using his familiar symbols, the radiating baby, the angel, that sort of thing. So this is, of course, part of the AIDS quilt that was a huge project to essentially memorialize the tens of thousands of people that were lost to AIDS in the 1980s and beyond. So Keith Haring, as this artist who wanted to create huge projects accessible to everybody, things that couldn't be contained by museums, is now just a small piece of the AIDS quilt, which is so big it couldn't be contained by the mall in Washington, D.C. It's too big for the mall. So it's an incredible artistic legacy that was cut short way too soon. As we think about young Keith Haring, he was just 31 years old when he died in 1990. And sometimes in hindsight, critics sort of poke at the fact that his style never really changed during his career, during the decade that he was producing work, didn't really evolve. And I think you can't make that criticism. He didn't really have the chance to. His life was cut so tragically short. It's heartbreaking to think what he could have accomplished had he lived longer. During that decade where he was productive, he produced 10,000 works of art, 50 major murals, only about 31 of them still survive today, and close to 50 one-man shows. So, I mean, that's just like, what, 5 one-man shows a year? Think about how much work this was. If he was alive today, he'd be 64 years old. But of course, because he died so young, he will be forever young. He got his dream. He was an artist who worked in France. This is him just outside of Paris in front of a blimp that he designed. He wanted to make art that would be seen. He wanted to make something that people could connect to, even if it was temporary. And we see that happening with the blimp and with the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade float over here. This is 2008. He is now a recognizable part of American culture, even if a little bit of the oomph of that AIDS advocacy is kind of drained from that work today. These images, I think, are still so beloved. And he had a huge impact on artists that followed him too. Artists like Jeff Koons over here, who really focused on the commodification of art, a little bit on celebrity too. Banksy, the anonymous graffiti artist who's based out of the UK, he is doing socially conscious tags around the world. And then Murakami, who licenses these very popular designs that he creates for all kinds of products today. probably wouldn't do any of this without Keith Haring being the forerunner. And all of these artists, or most of them, are using kind of this the same kind of graphic style that Keith Haring is so well known for. In fact, we probably wouldn't have the logos that we're all so familiar with today without Keith Haring kind of introducing this cartoon style and this bold simplicity into the world of art. Things come full circle because on Keith Haring's 54th birthday, there was a Google Doodle homepage that appropriated his images into the letters forming the word Google. So we'll wrap up tonight with a look at how Keith Haring's work fares in the art market today. Here he is with a decorated boombox, which is just so perfect because he loved music. He would always work to music. But the work over here on the right is one that sold just last year at Christie's for close to $6 million. And this is sort of the upper amount that that his work has gone for at auction at the major auction houses. And it sounds like a lot of money, right? But when you compare that to the work of somebody like Andy Warhol, who's one of his Maryland paintings just went for close to $200 million. You can see that this is just a drop in the bucket. But I think, having a big fancy art collector buy one of his paintings was never Keith Haring's goal. He would have been much happier with 3 million people buying, a $3 pin at the pop shop. He wanted his art to get to people, make it as accessible as possible. That was the legacy of Keith Haring. So we will end there for tonight, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about the artist. I'll start looking at the chat too. Oh, Michael, thanks for joining us from Birmingham, Alabama. That's so cool. And I think Michael was asking, are Keith Haring's works in museums? Yes, especially in modern art collections. So like the Museum of Modern Art would be a good place to work, to look for some of his works. Andy Warhol is at probably every major encyclopedic museum you can think of. Let's see here. Judy, thanks for your kind words. I appreciate that. And Neil, you too. And I think that's most of it. So as always, if you have any questions or corrections along the way, thank you, Jill. I'm so glad you could come tonight. I knew this would speak to you. Any questions, corrections, or comments along the way, feel free to reach out to me at my website, iamculturallycurious.com. I always love to hear from people too. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining the Manchester City Library, the Wadley Memorial Library, the Goffstown Library, and New England College Libraries for this educational program. I hope you have a great night. There's a survey link in the chat, and I'll also be sending out a survey link in a couple days with the recording of the program. If you joined us today but you didn't register, I don't have your email to send you the recording. So if you do want it, make sure you sign up either at one of the libraries where you found the link, or through, I think we're on Eventbrite as well. So thank you all and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.